Hello, I'm Anastasia Amoroso, and this is Beyond 6040. Today, I'm very pleased to share with you a very timely conversation, an in-depth geopolitical discussion with Admiral James Stavridis. He is a partner and vice chair of global affairs at the Carlyle Group. And our recent conversations span today's most pressing geopolitical issues, from tariffs to global security to investment opportunities and much more. I personally found this conversation incredibly insightful, and I think you will too. Here it is. I'm pleased to welcome my guest, Admiral James Stavridis, partner and vice chair of global affairs at the Carlyle Group. There, he focuses on advising senior leadership on geopolitical and international financial opportunities. Admiral Stavridis is a retired four-star officer and former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO. He holds a PhD in international relations from the Tufts University, and he is now a senior military analyst with CNN, opinion columnist at Bloomberg, and author of 15 books and over 1,000 articles. Admiral, it is a pleasure to have you here today. It is an honor.
My honor, Anastasia.
Thanks so much for joining us today. What I would say is just a critical moment when it comes to geopolitics and economics around the world. And, in recent history, in recent memory anyway, I can't think of a time that perhaps was more uncertain, with the tariffs flying back and forth, with so many conflicts around the world that are unsettled. So let's start there. Let's start with the tariffs discussion. And what is your prognosis, and how does this chapter end?
We just don't know. And that perhaps is the most concerning thing. So if you think about the Trump policies, they tend to be kind of quasi-isolationist, a bit of a withdrawal from the world that weakens our alliances. Secondly, they're highly erratic. It's one moment massive tariffs, we're carpet bombing the global economy. I like tariffs when they're used in a precision-guided way. And then third and finally, it's very divisive, and it creates schisms between not only frenemy trading partners like China, the two largest economies in the world, but drives real wedges between the United States, Mexico, Canada, NATO, Europe. So when I look at all that, I'm very concerned. I think the final thought would be, let's look at history as a guide. Let's go back about 100 years ago when the United States took a similar course. We pulled out of Europe at the end of the First World War. Our economy started booming in the 20s and then gradually started to wind down. And we introduced tariffs, the Hawley-Smoot tariffs. How'd that turn out?
Not very well.
We cracked the global economy and you end up in the Second World War. So that's the dark end of the spectrum. But I am very concerned about the erratic quality of what's happening right now. Very difficult for markets.
All right. But I wonder if this precision guidance that you mentioned, I wonder if we're starting to see that, because instead of a blanket tariff and instead of this table of tariffs, we've rolled back a lot of them. And maybe we now do focus on pharmaceutical and semiconductors. You think that's where the administration is headed?
I do, and I hope so. However, there doesn't seem to be a plan. And that, again, creates uncertainties. And as the saying goes, money is a coward. Money flees uncertainty. And so until the markets and businesses can see real sense of planning to get to that precision-guided piece, I think we're going to see these markets go up and down, up and down.
Well, we've certainly seen that. And you're right. All that uncertainty has certainly caused investors to flee. But you've worked with leaders across the world, including leaders in Europe. And I wonder, how are our allies thinking about this right now? Do they acknowledge that this is the art of the deal, this is a negotiation, they look through it? Or is there really a sense of resentment that's starting to build? And can we go back from that brink?
I'd say, unfortunately, the latter. More and more, my contacts, my network, my circuits in Europe are buzzing about the need for Europe to simply break course, break company with the United States. What does that mean? It means building their own defenses. That's money and investments that will flow to European defense companies, not to the United States, which is the current case. Secondly, this kind of division will cause the Europeans to step back and say, I wonder if we should take another look at that Belt and Road Initiative that China is offering. Could we see the Europeans start to cut individual or even collective trade deals with China? Or how about this? The Europeans decide, that NAFTA, USMCA, that looks pretty good. Trump is slapping big tariffs on Mexico and Canada. How about if we, the Europeans, approach Canada and Mexico about a North Atlantic free trade zone that might not include the United States? Now, all those are pretty far out in the spectrum of possibility at the moment, but to answer your question, I feel a lot of divisiveness in the traditional relationships for the United States that will harm us over the long
Right.
term.
And that certainly feels like a difference and change in the world order. If you read the Chip Wars, the book that really provides a great overview of history, how did the supply chain, specifically in the semiconductor industry, got to be so intertwined? And it was seeking the best cost of production, the best location. But I think partially it's really trying to prevent what was the Second World War and the possibility of that happening. The theory was that if you integrate the supply chains, you can do that. Are we tearing up that playbook entirely right now?
It feels like we are. And by the way, it's not just chips and chip wars by Dr. Chris Miller. There are shoe wars going on. There are iron wars. There are auto wars. There are a lot of wars that are suddenly potential conflicts at the moment, economic conflicts. But God forbid this bleeds over into actual conflict. We talked about history a moment ago. Let's go back even a bit over 100 years ago, 1914. All the economies of Europe are intertwined. In fact, the royal families, I don't need to tell you as a Russian American, the royal families are intermarried. The Kaiser of Germany is the nephew of Queen Victoria of England. Everyone felt, we'll never get into war because we're so economically entwined. How'd that work out?
It did not.
Yeah, by 1918, the Russian Empire is gone, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is gone, the Ottoman Empire is gone, the lights have gone out in Europe, and we can drop a plumb line from there to the trade wars, the tariff barriers of the 1930s, which ultimately led to the Second World War. But to your question, can trade wars become real wars? You bet. And we ought to be mindful of that.
I do want to talk about the national security implications of that, but I do also want to talk about the U.S.-China relationship in particular, because it seems like despite maybe the back channel feelings, most allies, most partners are trying to cut a deal with the United States. That doesn't seem to be the case with China. It seems like this is the worst standoff that we have seen for some time, and certainly worse than we've seen in 2019. What's going on there?
Well, as we conduct this marvelous conversation this morning, tariffs are about 100 round numbers, 150% on Chinese goods coming to the U.S. and about 110% on American goods going to China. The bad news is these are the two largest economies in the world. Huge drag in the international system. And so the question becomes, how's it going to come out? And the answer is, I can tell you that in 3 words. I don't know. Nobody knows.
Does President Trump know?
Not at all. And I think it is unknowable. And this, again, is why markets are so roiled right now. But I'll give you a snapshot of possibilities. I think there's about a 30% chance that we do end up in a modus vivendi, a way of living with China that will probably have 20%-ish tariffs going both ways and some insistence on buying American goods and freeing up some of the intellectual property concerns we have. Here's the bad news. I think there's a 60% chance these economies seriously decouple. We'll know a lot more, I think, over the next month or so. But I'll tell you, from where I sit today, it feels unlikely that Xi Jinping is going to blink.
Right. So you are the Carlyle Group, and you must have a lot of global companies with global supply chains. And as you think about the 60% probability, how are those companies thinking about managing those supply chains?
Well, I'll start with a very practical thing that I would say to anybody running a company. And we have 270 portfolio companies at Carlyle. One thing we're doing now, given all of this geopolitical churn, is ensuring that our cyber defenses are strong. Every company of any size ought to be thinking about the potential for a cyber attack. It could come from China, it could come from Russia, it could come from North Korea. If those talks go south with Iran, it could come from Iran. So, number one, protect your cyber flank. Number two, diversify. think about where else can I get these particular raw materials. And if you're an American firm, pretty obviously, you're looking at what are the U.S. equivalents of these. There's no quick answer on an awful lot of that, but diversification is a second big piece of this. And then number three is through all of your networks and means as a company, you ought to be pushing for negotiation, for resolution. And I am hopeful that the Trump strategy ultimately is to cut a deal.
So despite that we still hope to get a deal, the advice to the portfolio companies would still be to diversify the supply chains today.
Absolutely. And this would be in nautical terms, you should have an anchor to windward, meaning that if you think the winds are going to start blowing very strongly, you better have an anchor so you don't get dragged ashore. And that means diversification. And again, the bad news is that's hard work and involves real risk and real cost.
I love the anchor analogy. We could certainly use an anchor in the markets right now. But before we leave the U.S.-China relationship, I want to talk about Taiwan.
Sure.
And the market participants have worried about the future of China-Taiwan for a long time. But it seems like there's been more recent military exercises. And now with a standoff between U.S. and China, what's the future of Taiwan?
I think for the 5-year future, it still feels unlikely to me that China would make a military move. I'll tell you why. Number one, Xi Jinping has a big, capable military, but it has no experience in combat. He doesn't have a single admiral or general who has seen combat. He doesn't know how his military would perform. A lot of uncertainty. Number two, sanctions, even increased over what we see now. Real economic pain to China at a moment when their economy, frankly, is still sputtering a bit, even from COVID. And number three, he doesn't know how hard the Taiwanese will fight, how effective they will be.
And perhaps how much support they might have.
Correct. And by the way, Xi Jinping, he's never been to Taiwan. I've been to Taiwan plenty. I know their military. I think they'll fight. I think they'll fight hard. And to conquer an island, that's a serious military challenge. You know, think of Game of Thrones. Why are there moats around castles? Water is a big obstacle, and that's just a little moat around a castle. Try 100 miles of open sea. That's a tough military proposition. Could I see economic pressure put on Taiwan? Could I see a kind of a blockade around the island? I think those are real possibilities, and the more we pressurize China in the economy, the more the chances go up of that occurring.
And perhaps that's even more reason to think about onshoring some of the semiconductor supply chains. All right, let's move to the other part of the world that you spend a lot of time in, which of course being the Supreme Allied Commander and leading NATO from 2009 to 2013. The situation in Ukraine and the ongoing, Russian invasion of Ukraine, how does that end? Or most importantly, when does this end? Because coming into the year, we were somewhat optimistic about a quick deal getting done.
I think we will get a ceasefire this year. There's still a lot of 2025 to go. Incentives for the Ukrainians are simply the pressure being put on them by the United States and also by Europe. The Europeans and the U.S. both want Ukraine to get to a negotiation. The key is going to be whether Putin is willing to negotiate. I think over the next month or so, we're going to see if the Trump administration is willing to put serious pressure on Putin to bring him to the table. I think they will. Trump wants to cut a deal. He wants the strategic minerals. He wants a piece of the reconstruction of Ukraine, which will be a huge business opportunity. Think South Korea at the end of the Korean War. So all those reasons come together, and I think ultimately we get to a negotiation, a ceasefire late this year. I'd say that's a 70% chance. Unfortunately, there's a 30% chance that Putin just doesn't buy into that, continues grinding away. The best thing we could do right now from an investment perspective and also from a national security perspective, get more weapons in the hands of the Ukrainians, make sure they can hold their current position, keep Putin pushed off into the 20% of Ukraine that he currently holds, recognize that's probably not going to be returned, and get them to the table and cut a deal.
Well, I have two follow-up questions on that. First of all, our willingness to continue to provide the financial support and the weapons. So maybe let's actually start with that one. It seems like the Trump administration has much diminished willingness to do that. And as a result, the European allies need to step up. Um, is that going to be enough to continue to support Ukraine?
Yes, if necessary. There are 450 million Europeans. We're about 350 million. Their economy collectively is the second largest in the world after the U.S. And by the way, their defense spending collectively is the second largest in the world. The EU spends more on defense than China does, much more than Russia does. So they have the capacity. And final thought, 7 of the 20 largest defense companies in the world are European. Airbus, Leonardo, Thales, BAE, etc. So the capacity is there. The question is the will there? I think it is. And I'll put it this way. When Russian tanks roll west, be that at the end of World War II, into Hungary in 56, into Prague in 68, into Gdansk, it rattles old ghosts in Europe. Yes, I think the Europeans are stepping up. I think they will. And here's an investment implication. Those European defense stocks are going to look pretty good.
And they have already.
And oh, by the way, U.S. defense stocks will get perhaps a temporary bump, but over time, the Europeans are going to build their own defense industrial base. They're going to have their own army, a collective army. I think all that's coming, not because President Trump has pressurized them. It's going to be because they have watched Vladimir Putin. He has rattled old ghosts. Europe, I think, finally is going to stand together.
He has indeed, but I wonder, what is the future of the security guarantees that President Zelensky wants? Is it the troop commitment? Is it the financial commitment? Is it the equipment commitment? What is it the Europeans are willing to provide that would make this a permanent ceasefire?
I'll give you 3 things that I think are largely agreed to in Brussels. Number 1 is a European force in Ukraine. That's not going to be a problem for the Europeans to provide it. It might be a problem getting Putin to accept it. But think 20,000-ish troops, probably a combination of British, French, maybe Poles, maybe Germans, certainly some Nordics, certainly some Baltics. And don't forget, Europeans collectively have over 1 million young men and women under arms. So they can put that force in. That's security guarantee number 1. Number 2, I would argue, is bring them into the European Union. I think NATO is a bridge too far, but moving quickly, and Ursula von der Leyen, the leader of the European Union, has spoken often about the need to get Ukraine into the EU because of the security guarantees. And then number 3, the United States doesn't have to put troops on the ground, but we do need to provide backup support in everything from intelligence to air defense to satellites to logistics. And the U.S. is very well positioned to do that. When I commanded NATO, I had 100,000 U.S. troops stationed in Europe. They're still there. That can be the back office for this. All that creates real security guarantees. I think it's a doable negotiation.
So is there hope then for the future of united NATO and for the future of the Transatlantic Alliance, despite what might have been a loss of hope given what we witnessed in the White House earlier this year?
Yeah, I think the way to think of it is there's a transatlantic bridge. It goes from North America, U.S. and Canada, to our European partners. And that bridge is not only NATO, that's the military piece, it's a huge economic bridge as well. And it's a cultural values-based bridge: democracy, freedom, gender equality, racial equality. Okay, your point. That bridge is creaking a little bit. But if you go to the public in both Europe and the United States, you still see overwhelming majority support for NATO, for our European partnerships. And I think that that bridge is going to creak and squeak, but I don't think it's going to break. I don't think it's going to blow up. Yes.
It'll hold. All right, my last question on this. What is it that Putin wants from a permanent ceasefire, and is there a chance that it's palatable
Yeah.
to all the other stakeholders.
Well, what Putin wants is what he wanted 3 years ago when he told Xi Jinping at the Olympics just before the invasion. He pulled Xi aside, reportedly, and said, hey, just want to give you a little heads up. I'm going to sweep into Ukraine. I'm going to cut through that place like a knife through butter. I'm going to grab that little comedian Zelensky and throw him in Leforto prison. None of that happened, but that's what Putin wants. And I'll tell you why. Putin wants Ukraine for the good old-fashioned reason people conquer other countries. He wants the resources. He wants the 40 million people. Russia, as you well know, is in demographic decline. Putin has lost 1 million young men in this war thus far. He is desperate for those 40 million Ukrainians. Plus, it's the breadbasket of Europe. It's full of oil, gas, potash, rare earths, which Trump wants to negotiate for. Putin wants it all. So that's what he wants. The question is, what's he willing to settle for? I think, given the circumstances on the battlefield, and if the United States remains even modestly supportive and the Europeans are strongly supportive, I think Putin will settle for the following: Crimea, the 4 provinces of the Donbass that connect Crimea by a pretty substantial land bridge up to the Rodina, Mother Russia. I think that chunk would satisfy him, at least temporarily. And that also encompasses a large segment of the Ukrainian population that are native Russian speakers that have some proclivities toward Russia itself that are positive. All of that tells me Putin would settle for the 20%. What does he want in addition? And this would have to be part of the deal. He wants his money back, the $300 billion in Russian assets that are currently in European banks, and he wants sanctions relief in a big way. He wants membership in the G7, now back to the G8, and he wants all of his oligarchy to be able to go to their nice villas in Nice and enjoy the summer in the Mediterranean.
Been too long.
Been way too long for them. So he wants a lot. I think that if Ukraine gets the security guarantees we talked about and gets reconstruction from the West, which would be smart on our part, I think you can see the shape of a deal there. Hey, last thought. I get this question a lot. Well, wait a minute, Admiral. Does NATO really want Ukraine? Here's my answer. 40 million people. When this war is over, Ukraine will have the most capable, highly blooded, technologically advanced land forces in Europe. Yeah, we want them on Team NATO. I think that's how it ends up, even if it's the 80% solution, which is what I think.
We want Ukraine on Team NATO and on Team EU. And
Correct.
We are hopeful that a more permanent ceasefire can be achieved, and hopefully this year. But perhaps on a lighter note, but
Sure.
We'll see. Let's talk about artificial intelligence. And I know you spend a lot of time thinking about artificial intelligence, the risks and opportunities. In fact, you wrote a book recently, 2054, that has a lot to do with it. So what do you say to clients, to companies about the opportunities or threats of AI today?
Yeah, number one, you've got to be there. No matter what level of enterprise you're running, you have to be open to getting engaged in AI. And it can be as small as using it to provide advice and a set of ideas for your supply chains, your logistics, your maintenance. It can be as big as being an AI company. So there's a big spectrum of investment. Where I'm really focused at the moment is AI in defense, AI in military operations. This is a very rich opportunity for investment that encompasses everything from managing swarms of drones to providing tactical advice to commanders in the field. Think about yourself as the captain of a destroyer. You're operating in the Mediterranean. You're seeing an air defense problem. In your ear is an artificial intelligence who can, in 1 microsecond, survey every air defense engagement that's ever been conducted and can advise you, Captain, get your missiles pointed in this direction with this level of response. So there's an immense, rich area. And final thought, maintenance and logistics. That's the real heartbeat of combat, is getting the right stuff to the right place at the right time. That is a task made for artificial intelligence.
Right. And of course, that was such a problem in the early days of the Russia invasion of
Exactly. This
Ukraine.
was the greatest failure of Russia. The reason
Logistics.
Correct. Their logistics failed them. Their generals failed them.
Right. But artificial intelligence and the application of it in defense, Admiral, I think you've just given us the best investment opportunity for 2025 and I'm sure beyond. But I guess to close out the conversation, I'm so honored you've joined us today and you've had such an incredible career.
Thank you.
You've spent 37 years in the Navy. You went into academics after that. And of course, you've been at Carlyle since 2018. Has there been a favorite chapter? Has there been a favorite memory?
I loved each of my 3 careers, if you will, in different ways. The military, pretty obviously, all about serving and kind of the adventure of it and wearing a sharp uniform. I loved being in the military and serving the country. As dean of a law school, the joy was mentoring. It was taking care of these young graduate students coming through the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and helping shape their views and ideas and helping them find the right positions in life. I'll tell you what I love about the Carlyle Group. I love it that everything I do is different every minute. It's the agility needed. And to all the financial professionals out there, I would say take joy in the fact that everything is constantly moving. What makes life interesting is problem solving. And in finance, and as our conversation today really indicates, there's a lot of problems to be solved, a lot of different areas. And ultimately, the joy I take in my job today is solving big problems across all these sectors and globally.
Well, there's no shortage of big problems out there. And we're so thankful, first of all, for your service to this country. We're so thankful for the mentorship that you've provided to students and also investors across the years. And thank you so much for your terrific perspective today. It's been immensely helpful for us and for our investors. Thanks so much, Admiral.
Thanks, Anastasia.
Thank you.
What a pleasure.
What a pleasure. Thank you for watching. I hope my conversation with Admiral Stavridis has given you a clearer perspective on the complex geopolitical challenges facing businesses and policymakers today. And we'd like to hear from you. Send us an email at yourquestion@icapital.com and let us know what questions are the top of mind for you and your clients. I'm Anastasia Amoroso, and we'll see you next time on Beyond 6040.